What's going on, ladies, gents, and kids of all ages? It is Eric coming back at you once again from the Nerd Cave, and today we're going to be exploring part 2 in our series about how to be a better deck builder and player. In Deck Build 101, we talked about the absolute basic fundamentals of how to build and play a deck when it comes to Disney Lorcana. We didn't talk about the basic rules. If you're looking for a how to play Lorcana video, those videos are out there, but if you're looking for something to make you a better player and deck builder, definitely check out our 101 video if you haven't already. Before jumping into this video, where we're going to be talking about more intermediate level knowledge. But the first thing we have to talk about before we dive too far down the rabbit hole into stuff that's going to be more on the intermediate level, I want to talk about what some of the different colors are going to do for you and what may be the best color for you to play and how to make those decisions. Just because a deck is the best deck doesn't mean it's going to be the best deck for you. You hand a Ruby Sapphire deck to a new player, they're going to struggle with it. You even look at things like Diggy Diggy Hole, in my opinion, a bit of a more straightforward deck to play than Ruby Sapphire. You still see people really not using the mines to their full potential. You see people making choices with that deck that maybe aren't the best choices, inking again when they don't have to ink because they don't need more ink with that deck, are some great examples. Before we dive too far into talking about the different colors and what they're going to offer you when it comes to deck building, as always, I want to give a big shout out to the Patreons for making the giveaways on the channel possible. We are inching closer every day to 3,000 subscribers, so thank you to the folks who are taking the time to click that subscribe button. And when we get there, we're going to be looking at doing another big giveaway, most likely another booster box. So if you're not subscribed, now is a great time to do so. Got lots of people tuning into the channel. Tune into multiple videos who aren't subscribed. It's not going to hurt you to subscribe, and if you want to get notified when new videos go live, slap the bell. But without any further ado, let's jump into talking about some intermediate level tips to be a better deck builder and Lorcana player. So the first color we're going to talk about is Amber. What is Amber going to offer you when it comes to deck building and playing the game? To me, this boiled down to 3 primary mechanics that aren't all exclusive to Amber. One of them most certainly is, and maybe the most important one. But the first one we're going to be talking about is bodyguards. We do see bodyguards also in Steel, but bodyguards are super important to what Amber wants to do. You've got some small questing characters. You've got characters like Piglet and Lilo that have a very weak defensive stat line, so having a bodyguard to prevent them from taking direct challenges right away is going to be super important. So you're looking at some great options in things like Simba, a 2/3 for 2 with bodyguard, Donald Duck, same stat line but giving something else an additional lore when it comes into play if you're trying to play that more aggro strategy, and even things like Baloo. He's going to be a 0/3 stat line and he's uninkable, but he gives you 2 lore when he gets banished. So I mean, there's some really interesting bodyguards inside of Amber, and they're just going to help you do what you need to do that much more effectively. As I mentioned, we do have aggro characters in Amber like Lilo, Daisy Duck, Piglet. These are all going to be super important to what Amber wants to do. So if you're trying to play a more aggro bodyguard strategy, Amber may be the place to be. The other big thing you want to do with Amber is use singers. They're not always as relevant to the aggro strategy, but when you look at the more traditional Steel song, or even when you step outside to other Amber combinations outside of Amber Steel, the singers can be really important in what they do. You look at cards like Ariel, a 2/3 for 3 that comes into play, not only lets you look for a song on the top of your deck, but also has Singer 5 to be able to sing some of the most vital songs in the game. And then we also do have characters like Cinderella, one of the best 1-drops in Amber, a 1-cost 1/2 that's going to let you sing 3. We have cards like Gaston and Ursula as well that are very important singers, cards that we see people play quite often. So if you're looking to take advantage of those songs to the best of their ability, you're looking to play an aggro deck, or you want to take advantage of bodyguards, Amber may be a good color option for you. Then jumping over to Amethyst, possibly one of the most flexible colors in the game in terms of what it can do and how it can strategize differently in different decks. Amethyst is a color we've seen combined with really every other color out there. Amethyst Amber has fallen off in the current meta a little bit, but Amethyst Amber Hyper Aggro can still be a very good deck in the right meta and is very likely to have its day in the sun again. Some of the things Amethyst can do for you is draw cards like crazy. That's one of the most important things Amethyst is going to do for you. You have fantastic card options like Genie, Merlin Rabbit, Chernobog's Followers, Magic Brooms, not to mention various other cards that have come and gone, and some that we may see in the future. I don't see drawing cards effectively to be a thing that goes away from Amethyst anytime soon. You do also have access to rush characters inside of Amethyst, something that some other colors don't have access to at all. Some of the best rush characters, in fact, are in Amethyst, and I'm talking about Mim Fox and Elsa. But then you do also have things like Pan Shadow that are really super interesting in a deck that is playing into Evasive. Mim Fox, for instance, is one of the best cards in the game in my opinion still to this day, and Elsa is definitely showing that she can put in work with rush and Evasive on a 5-drop, not to mention being a great option for shifting if you do want to get that big Elsa into your deck. Amethyst also has access to Evasive characters. We're only going to talk about a couple of them, but they are very important, and those are going to be Genie and Elsa. Now, we talked about those in draw and rush, but they let you do those things. Genie is probably one of the most effective cards in the meta right now. He is terrible against Brawl, so if you're in a Brawl heavy meta, you're playing against a lot of Ruby Amethyst or Ruby Sapphire, I probably wouldn't tech in those Genies, and even Elsa can be kind of bad in those matchups. However, if you're not in a super heavily Ruby meta, both of those cards are going to be fantastic. The other thing that Amethyst has access to that is really kind of unique to Amethyst specifically and doesn't cross over into really any other colors in my opinion is going to be the ability to have access to the bounce package. Yes, Emerald has bounce cards. They are mostly cards that are intended to target your opponent's characters and not necessarily something you would want to use on yourself. Some of them have to target your opponent's characters, in fact, whereas the Mim and Merlin package is always going to be looking at targeting your own characters, bouncing them to your hand and putting them back into play. I know not everybody understands immediately why it's good to return characters to your hand. If your character has an ability that says when you play it, do X thing, then it is going to be really good to be able to play it a second time, especially if that thing is relevant to your strategy. You look at cards like Lady Tremaine and Madame Medusa that are going to let you banish your opponent's characters. When you can bounce those to your hands and do that every turn, it can get really kind of nutty. So bounce has continued to be very good. The other thing with Amethyst is it does also have access to those aggro characters. So again, if you're looking to combine with Amber or perhaps with Emerald to do a more aggro strategy where you're able to just quest out really quickly into the game, Amethyst can be a great color combo with those two options. You have things like Maleficent biding her time, Pinocchio, and the Genie yet again as a fantastic option inside of Amethyst to be able to aggro quest in your opponent's face very early in the game. Jumping over to Emerald and what they're going to do differently, they are also going to have access to those aggro characters like I mentioned in Curse Merfolk, Flynn Rider, Olivia Flaversham, Cricky, and even cards like Ray, who I still think can potentially be good in the right deck. But some of the things it's going to do that other colors aren't necessarily as focused on are going to be things like opposing character bounce. Like I had mentioned, they do also have access to bounce cards. A lot of it's going to be looking to bounce opposing characters to your opponent's hand. Even those ones that aren't are generally going to be better in a deck where that is what you're doing with them, but you have tons of opposing bounce cards like Mother Gothel, Genie, Mother Knows Best, Cloud Kicker, You're Welcome. The Muses can bounce something every time you play a song, so all of those can be fantastic for just keeping the tempo in your favor and keeping your opponent's board clear. Emerald is also going to be a great color to steer into if you're looking to play an evasive heavy deck. You have some of the best evasive options in the game with cards like Go-Go Tamago, Genie on the Job, Sir Hiss, Pegasus, Tinkerbell, and even Diablo. That's not only going to be evasive, but let you get some fantastic card draw. The other main thing Emerald is going to be letting you do is going to be to discard your opponent's hands. This is going to be really the only color that has effective access to discard, so if you want to play a discard strategy, Emerald is definitely the color for you. However, everybody is going to hate you for doing it. Everyone I know was pretty happy when Bucky got altered into Oblivion, but even without Bucky, you still have access to some fantastic cards to make your opponent discard with things like Curse Merfolk, Ursula, Prince John, and Sudden Chill. Prince John isn't actually going to make them discard, but when you combine it with discard elements, it's easily one of the best cards in the game, especially because it has ward. So if you're looking to go aggro or discard or a combination of the two, Emerald's probably where you want to be. Jumping over to Ruby, Ruby is one of those colors that's really interesting because it's a fantastic support color with another color that is going to feed into it well. That's why it's combined so well with Sapphire and with Amethyst. Amethyst is going to give it that card draw to keep the fuel, and Sapphire is going to give it that ink ramp to play those Ruby threats even sooner, but it doesn't really have access to a lot of super unique abilities. It does have a handful of evasive characters, doesn't really have anything to let you draw. It has a couple things to let you deal some direct damage, but they're not very good, so it doesn't have access to as much of a plethora of things. There's no bodyguard, no ward, but what it does have is it does have rush characters, and in fact it has some of the best rush characters in the game with things like Maui Hero to All, Queen of Hearts, Scar, the Stitch Little Rocket, Vitalisphere, which can give something rush, and Jolly Roger, which can give every character that goes into it rush and lets pirates move into it for free. So if you're looking to play a rush deck, Ruby can be a fantastic option. There's also things like Goofy that I know people have been hot on, the Super Goof. But what Ruby is really doing, and what is going to be most important, and the main reason that people choose to play Ruby in combination with those other colors, is going to be the fantastic access to some of the best removal cards in the game. You have things like Lady Tremaine, Brawl, Madame Medusa, Be Prepared, Sisu, just tons and tons of direct removal options. Even looking at things that have kind of fallen out of the meta may come back around, like Prince Eric and Dragon's Breath. So I think Ruby is going to continue to be the best option for direct removal. We haven't seen a lot of those options in any other color. Ruby is the place to be if you're somebody who wants to focus on controlling the board with board wipes and additional direct removal. Jumping over to Sapphire. Sapphire is going to do few things very well, some of them better than any other color in the game. One of the things it does quite well, particularly in the item build, is going to be to draw cards with things like Hiram Flaversham combined with items like Popsicle, which is also going to give you card draw, Vision of the Future, which is going to let you dig several cards deep, and not to mention some of those other cards like Grandma Tala and How Far I'll Go, letting you just continue to draw further into your deck. You are going to have fantastic access to some of the best ward characters in the game inside of Sapphire, with cards like Alice, Duke Weaselton, Wendy Darling, and last but certainly not least, Cogsworth. Cogsworth is still one of the best ward characters in the game. It still is very good in Sapphire Steel. The two things that are going to be a little more unique to Sapphire are going to be items. Items do exist across multiple colors. You don't really see them see a lot of play in anything outside of Sapphire. Amber had its day in the sun with decks running Sleepy's Flute as well as Lantern, but Sleepy's Flute and Lantern have pretty much gone the way of the dodo when it comes to Amber Steel. However, items are still very much in the conversation when it comes to Sapphire, with cards like Popsicle, Ice Block, Fishbone Quill, and even cards like Maurice's Workshop, plus countless characters that work in combination with them to do various things when you have an item in play or when you draw an item. You have cards like Oswald that let you play items for free. Are those cards all being played as much? No, not necessarily, but when it comes to playing an item focused deck, Sapphire is definitely the place to be. And the biggest thing Sapphire does, and something that no other color is really going to do effectively, you look at something like Amber that has access to Lantern and Dock that can make things cost one less. It's kind of neat. Does feel a little bit like ramp, but when it comes to ink ramping, Sapphire is definitely the place that you want to be. You have access to cards like One Jump Ahead, Fishbone Quill, Tipo, Sail the Azure at Sea, How Far I'll Go, and more, that are going to let you continue to ink multiple times per turn. Not only ink multiple times per turn, but in some instance ink uninkable card, which is just going to be absolutely crazy to get ahead on your opponent. When you're sitting on a board state where you have 7 or 8 ink and your opponent has 4 or 5, you are going to be in a fantastic position. That being said, you do want to maintain those big threats in those decks, so if you are looking at an ink ramping strategy, make sure you have lots of big threats to take advantage of, but not so many big threats that you're not reliably accessing cards to play in the earlier turns of the game. This is a reason that Ruby Sapphire is so good, because it's just Ruby's threats plus Sapphire's ink ramp can be a very dangerous combination. And the last and certainly not least color that we're going to talk about is going to be Steel, with access to a couple things that we see across some of the other colors in small ways, with like Bodyguard, like I mentioned, we also have access to in Amber. But Bodyguard in Steel is going to give you access to some very good bodyguards like Chien Po. Pluto is getting played in pretty much every Steel deck right now. Kita, not so much, but I think she is a relevant bodyguard to at least mention. And then the Prince, which again, not really seeing play in the current meta, but there are other Steel bodyguards out there. Those are some that I think are worth noting. We're not going to talk about what Bodyguard does because we already covered it in Amber. We also have access in Steel to some of your glass cannon characters. What do I mean by glass cannons? I mean characters that are going to come down, they're going to have big bodies and deal a lot of damage, but they're going to be super affected by dealing that damage in a way that is going to be very negative for them. Some of those examples are Smee, Pluto, Lawrence, and Razul. Smee is taking 1 damage at the end of your turn, so if you're putting additional damage on him by challenging in, he is going to die very quickly. Pluto is only a 1/5 after he takes damage instead of a 5/5. Lawrence, same thing, goes from a 4/4 to a 0/4, and Razul goes from a 3/3 to a 1/3 once there's damage onto them. So even though they're very good for their ink costs, so you have like a 4/4 for 3, a 3/3 for 2, etc. Even though they're very good stat lines for their ink costs, once they take that damage, they become much weaker. One of the things that is the absolute best in Steel right now, especially because so many people are playing Steel, which focuses on dealing direct damage, is going to be resist characters. Resist characters have a resistance to damage when damage is dealt to them. If they are dealt 2, they only take 1 if they have resist 1. There's even characters out there like Big Cinderella who have resist 2, and they prevent 2 damage from every source of damage that deals damage to them. So say for instance you have Big Cinderella out with a 5/5 stat line, your opponent plays a Long Came Zeus on her, she only takes 3 damage and still has 2 health remaining. Some of the other resist characters worth noting are Tiana, which isn't seeing as much play now, but is another resist 2 character. Mickey Mouse, Food Fight Defender, which is a card that I've been talking about since the set came out as being a very relevant 1-drop for Steel in the current meta, and Calhoun, which is just absolute monster with a 3/2 stat line and resist 1. The last and maybe the most important thing that Steel has access to is going to be those direct damage cards. Like I mentioned, resist is going to make them feel a little less good, ward may potentially make them feel a little less good, but given the fact that most of the most important Steel cards are going to be songs, being able to sing them and keep tempo against your opponent is absolutely nutty, especially with cards like Along Came Zeus that are going to let you deal 5 damage to a character essentially for free if you can exert a character to sing it, is kind of mental. And then you have access to things like Let the Storm Rage On, Strength of a Raging Fire, and even cards like Tinkerbell, characters that are going to deal direct damage to your opponent's characters. Tinkerbell is still really good. Not only is she dealing that direct damage when she comes into play, but she's dealing it when she challenges in. So I think Steel is in a really super good place in the meta right now. Like I mentioned, people do have access to those ward characters and whatnot, which makes it feel a little less good. Not everybody's playing that type of style. We're seeing a lot of Diggy Hole, a lot of Ruby Sapphire, a lot of Ruby Amethyst in the current meta, kind of the things a lot of us would have expected. But if you are seeing that expected meta play out where you're living, try to play against it. Maybe think about playing something like Sapphire Steel if you're playing into a lot of Diggy Hole or a lot of Steel Song. Sapphire Steel can also be pretty good against Ruby Sapphire, so keep that in mind. Part 2, we're going to talk briefly about how to understand your play lines. So your play lines are going to be referring to what you want to be doing each turn. It is super important to understand your opponent's deck to understand those play lines. So take some time, watch some of those big events, see what type of deck lists people are running, make sure you understand what cards your opponent is going to have access to really understand your play lines. If you're going in with a heavy strategy of Daisy Duck's really good at the beginning, but if you're playing against Amethyst and your opponent's running into Mim Foxes, all of a sudden those Mim Foxes are going to make your Daisy Ducks really bad. So you want to be able to kind of insulate for something like that. So as opposed to going turn 1 Daisy Duck, turn 2 more Daisy Ducks, and then running into that Mim Fox that's going to start wiping out those Daisy Ducks, maybe turn 2 you go ahead and develop something like Calhoun, or you develop something else that can trade with that Mim Fox. So once they banish your Daisy Duck, you're ready to in turn banish their card, or you're ready to quest into their face again. Like you go turn 1 Daisy Duck, quest in, turn 2 you develop a Smee, they develop a Fox, they kill your Daisy Duck, and then you are all ready to go with that Smee to quest in again. Just keep the questing pressure on, and when they challenge into that Smee, they are going to kind of be getting 2 for 1 with that Fox, but you're still going to be continuing to quest into their face. So sometimes that can be the most relevant playline. Sometimes the more relevant playline, if you have like a removal option for when that Fox comes down, is maybe not to quest in at all. Wait for them to make a different choice on turn 3 or get some cards out that you can wipe out to allow them to not have the board presence to have anything to bounce with Fox. So there's some different playlines you can take advantage of in that early game, and it's important to understand how all of them are going to differ. Another great example of understanding understanding your playlines is if you're playing something like Ursula Deceiver, that's going to let you look at your opponent's hand, make them discard a song. If you're playing against something like aggro, they probably have no songs. You're probably better off inking that Ursula and playing something that's going to threaten their board on turn 2. However, if you're playing against a lot of other decks like Steel Song or really anything running Ruby, especially Ruby Sapphire, it's entirely likely that they are going to have a song for you to take away, and probably a song that's really important to them. So all of a sudden Ursula becomes a ton of additional value. You may even want to be getting multiple Ursulas down during the game, or if you're playing something like Emerald Amethyst, you may want to be taking advantage of bouncing those Ursulas as opposed to bouncing a 1-drop, so you can play them again and continue to rip songs out of your opponent's hand. So those are some of the examples of different play lines you can take. Don't fill up your board on turn 6 if you're playing as Ruby and your opponent's going to be prepared on turn 7. Don't draw a ton of cards if you're going into a turn where your opponent is playing Steel and may be able to sing something like Whole New World. Make sure you understand what your opponent's next move is most likely to be, given the cards that they have access to and what they're going to be able to do based on the amount of ink that they have on that turn. Obviously, you can't predict exactly what your opponent's hand, which is going to bring us to our third and final point when it comes to intermediate Lorcana play, and that is how to work through setbacks and when should you quest. So understanding your play lines is going to be super important to knowing when you should quest and when you shouldn't quest, but working through setbacks is something that is going to happen even if you're predicting your opponent's moves effectively. Always be prepared with an alternative strategy if you can. Don't build your deck to only do one thing. Build your deck to be flexible and have good options going into different turns. A great example of having good options is looking at something like the traditional Steel Song list, which on turn 3 could develop something like Ariel, which is going to be great to allow them to sing, or on turn 3 could develop something like Lawrence, which is going to be a huge body to threaten the board. What's going to end up being better? Well, it depends on what else is in your hand and not letting your opponent be able to get into a situation to cause you to have a setback. But let's say, for instance, on turn 3 you decide to develop that Ariel, you need to sing Whole New World, you're running out of gas, your opponent's just been absolutely controlling your field. All of a sudden your opponent does something else to control your field, they play something like Brawl, get rid of your Ariel. Now next thing you know, you don't have that card to sing the Whole New World. A fantastic alternative backup in that Steel Song deck is something like Prince Naveen that's going to come into play and let you sing immediately. It's a fantastic counter to somebody who's controlling your field to be able to go ahead and still get that Whole New World off without having to simply hard cast it. It's not typically going to leave you in a position where you can continue to play additional cards after it, which is something you would prefer to be able to do, but it is going to let you still get that Whole New World off and develop a character at the same time. You want to avoid letting your opponent create setbacks, so maybe in that instance where your opponent has a ton of removal, your opponent's playing Ruby and you think they're likely to be able to brawl your Ariel, maybe that is an instance where you play Lawrence instead. With its 4/4 stat line, it's not going to be affected by Brawl. One of the other great examples of working through setbacks was the discard meta, particularly with Bucky in the game. At the time I was playing Ruby Amethyst, a deck that people would say maybe doesn't have the greatest matchup against discard because you're trying to get up to a point where you can be prepared, and that it can't always happen when you don't have access to resources. So I learned pretty quickly my best option in the discard matchup was just to have a ton of stuff that let me draw cards when it was banished, or draw a card and replace itself when it came into play. Ink and draw cards, ink and draw cards. That was your answer to the discard match. Do I want to be doing removal and playing my foxes and doing all this fun stuff? Sure, that's fantastic in every other match, but when it comes to those discard match, you need resources in your hand, so you're not having to discard the resources that are most important to you. So working through those setbacks in that match can look at continuing to draw cards even though you're losing so many resources. Once you can get to that be prepared, they're typically not drawing enough cards after that to continue to control the field. It can definitely get away from you in some instances, but thankfully now Bucky has been eroded into oblivion, so we don't really have to worry about that. When should you quest? Questing should happen when the board is clear and your threat isn't going to be wiped out favorably. Questing can also be great if you play something like Akita that's going to prevent your opponent from damaging your characters, or you have a bodyguard down that you know your opponent can't get through, or if they do get through, they're not going to have another character that's strong enough to challenge and banish your characters that you want to keep on the board. So questing should always be done effectively. Like if you're just playing characters and questing into your opponent's face and then your opponent is banishing those characters, chances are at some point they're going going to gain the upper hand by removing enough of your characters while you're not removing theirs for them to be able to start questing in without even having to really worry about the board being threatened on your side. So keep in mind to quest when it is the most effective for you, when you can develop something to protect the quester, when you can use a card to bounce into your hand and play it back out ready, when you can do something like Sven that's going to let you just go ahead and ready it up. Like, there's a lot of different options in the meta right now to keep those characters protected in future turns. Alternatively, if you're playing against something like Steel and you have a Piglet out on the board and it's something they can very easily kill, quest in with it regardless. Like, if you know they're going to have that direct damage to banish your Piglet, quest in with it, because you don't want to be leaving something sitting, not getting a quest out of it, and then watching it get banished anyway. The important thing with when is the best time to quest is, again, understanding what your opponent's play lines look like so you can make the best decision about the play lines on your side. If your character is likely to be banished during your opponent's turn, regardless of questing, go ahead and quest. If your character is only going to be banished if you quest in and your opposing character isn't going to be banished, maybe that's a time that you don't want to quest. If there's any questions about anything that I talked about in this video, definitely make sure to throw it in the comments below. I always love to hear your questions. If you have any other things you want to hear me talk about, we're going to be talking a lot about how the bag works and how those cards kind of come out and how abilities trigger when we go into video 3. I know that's something a lot of people get confused about. If you have other advanced tips you're curious about, or advanced things when it comes to Disney Lorcana that you don't understand, that you want to hear me talk about more in the 3rd video in this series, definitely drop it in the comments below. If this video reaches 100 likes, we will be looking at doing that 3rd video. We got lucky with the last video and it got way up there. You guys took the time to like it up and down, so slap that like button if you're enjoying this series. Remember to subscribe, and if you have any thoughts on this series, leave a comment below. If there's any deck lists you want to see, let me know. Let's have a conversation down there. And when you see those toys, video games, and tips on how to be a better Lorcana player off in the distance, remember, it is not a mirage. You guys have a great day.